Crash Bandicoot has always been a series that fans love for its hilarious and wacky cast, its addictive platforming, its satisfying gameplay, and last but not least, the character's appeal in general. Crash was one of those characters that literally highlighted what gaming was all about back in the 90s. Platformers. But as of recent, our Bandicoot hero has found himself in a bit of a struggle, and has had difficulty in keeping a permanent image that would do him justice in the world of modern day gaming. The last adventure that we saw was Crash Mind Over Mutant, and while that game was a breath of fresh air and quite entertaining, certain fans still disliked the game due to its similarities to Crash of the Titans, and some felt that the creativity was lacking in concept, and that the game could have done more with it. It has now been 7 years since we've last seen Crash Bandicoot in any sort of game, but I've come up with a clever topic to speak about. Since Crash Bandicoot is gone for now, and probably won't be back for a long time, I've developed concepts to what a comeback for Crash Bandicoot could in fact be like. You see, the issue is that if Crash comes back with gameplay reminiscent of either of his previous installments 100%, then the series could quite possibly die. I would not like to see this happen. Here are my ideas of possible ways that Crash Bandicoot could arrive once again, and make platforming fans fall in love with this once beloved and currently loved icon. Now for general gameplay ideas. First things first. It has to be a completely reimagined story that removes all the previous plot holes. It has to be diverse, but also remind fans of reminiscent moments that lay deeply in the minds of gamers around the world. My approach would be that the game would be an open world, with a free romping style in vein of Mind Over Mutant, but it would be more refined. No, you wouldn't be fighting titans this time around. You would have a set of basic attacks, but you could also spin. You'd also have your classic slide, crawl, body slam, and double jump attacks right off the bat. This game would not be fighting oriented. It would not force you to fight enemies. The combat would come in handy for the bosses. Crash would also be able to dig underground, and chain by grabbing enemies from above and pulling them in and beating them up. Sometimes to disguise himself with silly looking disguises that would never work in real life, and yet they work in the game for comedic purposes. Crash would also have a health bar containing about 4 hit points. If Crash hits a nitro box, it will kill him instantly. If you have Aku Aku, it will kill him instantly. Having Aku Aku increases your health bar by 4 extra points. Whenever you are hit, Aku Aku loses a feather. If he loses them all, you are no longer protected. You'd also be able to do more things reminiscent of the past, such as run from boulders, but not in the same light as you'd be dodging them in real-time 3D rather than running away, and ride on Crash's signature waterboard to travel from island to island. All of the areas in the game will be connected like Mind Over Mutant, and the flow of the game will be almost the same as in Crash 1, with the following changes. You start off escaping Cortex's fortress on the 3rd island before ultimately coming up to a window which you must jump out of to escape and start the adventure off. Coco will replace Tawana in the game. There was really no purpose for her existence in the last series, so when rebooted, it would focus on Coco instead. But not only would it focus on Coco, it would also focus on the Bandicoots being evolved and brainwashed. Crash will have to stop Cortex from mutating other Bandicoots. The game would be funny in a sense similar to Ratchet and Clank's humor. Comedy would come from Crash's stupidity and Cortex's anger. Also, Engine and Brio would have their own hilarious tics. Levels would not exist, but areas from Crash Bandicoot 1 would. In the hub areas of the islands, there would be people to speak to, aka civilians. Also, areas in Crash 1 that were repeated twice would be removed, only containing one part, the prime example being Road to Nowhere, which would appear twice in the original. Also, you'd be bouncing on and smashing boxes, as well as jumping over pits, just as Crash Bandicoot is known for. Coco's gameplay, on the other hand, will be less like Crash Bandicoot, but retain the platforming elements. Coco will feature espionage action similar to Sly Cooper, and will be more combo-oriented than Crash's gameplay. Coco doesn't have Aku Aku. Instead, she has a shield. She has a standard meter instead of 4-meter branch system. As a result, Coco's gameplay is somewhat easier than Crash's story. Coco has kick attacks and a kick spin attack, but can also slide, Bruce Lee stomp, and double jump. She can't dig underground, but she can instead use gadgets as her special attack. Now for the visuals. The game will feature a dark yet cartoonish art style similar to Tim Burton, but the characters will look very similar to what they looked like in the past. Every character will be recognized instantly. Colors will be very vibrant, and the game will be in 3D. Now for the humor. The game's humor would be quite reminiscent of Ratchet and Clank, combined with radical entertainment era's Crash Bandicoot games combined. The game would be funny, but would also take itself seriously in certain spots. Humor would also come from the depths of Crash Bandicoot as well. The game would also make pop culture references and carry on the tradition of slapstick and cartoony humor. Now for the music. The music will have to capture the world of Crash Bandicoot. I'm thinking maybe Spiral Mouth or Mark Barrow would be great choices. The music would need to have a feel that truly captures the heart of this reboot. Remixes by these two would be godly for the game, but I would also appreciate it if they made original content as well. Now for the characters. In this reimagining, Cortex will be ruthless, a stressed-out doctor who wants his plans to be realized. He would have lost his mind in being rejected by the scientific officials when submitting his plan of changing innocent animals into giant anthro-mutants who will obey their masters. Cortex would also be more of a madman in this game to reflect on his personality from the first game, but would also have a hint of feminine mannerisms. Brio would be his partner in crime, and so would Engine, who would act as the second island's final boss before moving on to the next island. Brio will also begin to slowly hate Dr. Neocortex for taking his credit and such. Engine would be insane. All of your favorite bosses would return, but with more of a purpose. Papu Papu would negotiate deals with Dr. Cortex to capture Crash Bandicoot after Cortex literally buys the island off of Papu Papu in exchange for food. Pinstripe will be used as a personal bodyguard for Cortex and watch over the generators created by Brio to transform the animals into mutants. The generators would contain the liquid fuel which powered the Evolvo Ray's transformations. Coco would have her own story and would use martial arts. Her story would be virtually the same, but linked with Crash Bandicoot's story, and Coco's sequences would be played differently from Crash's as well. For example, Crash starts his adventure in the castle, Coco starts hers in the Jungle Rollers area. Koala Khan would be the first to last boss, and Cortex would be the final. Ripper Roo will be the last boss fight of the first island instead of the first of the second. Character designs. If Crash Bandicoot were to come back, then I would want to see him with a design that he could currently stick to. I would want it to have a very Tim Burton-ish art style, kind of like how Titans and Mind Over Mutant looked, but with a little more identity to the classic Crash Bandicoot series. This is why I made the characters look as what you're seeing right now. Each character was redesigned to give the game idea a grittier look. It would still be cartoonish, but it would also give the series a new identity to remember. The game would have a much grimmer look to it, but still remain true to the classic look of the Crash Bandicoot game. Here is a breakdown of the designs that I've currently come up with. Crash Bandicoot has a much rougher and more monstrous design. He would look similar to his past designs of Crash Bandicoot, but he would be more like an experiment with a band-aid on one arm from constant needles and a hole on the right leg of his jeans. His shoes went mainly unchanged from the modern games, and he still retains the rough fur. Coco Bandicoot would feature the most drastic change. Since Tawana wouldn't exist in this reboot, Coco has taken her hair's appearance, but wears goggles, a red shirt with hearts on the left chest, and Spade on the back, and fully covered in white on the outside. Coco wears skin-tight jeans and Chuck Taylors. She also has a tool belt and some goggles. Aku Aku is his old and new designs combined. Aku Aku is made of 5 planks that has 4 feathers wedged in between them. He has a face that's similar to classic Aku Aku, but has the grass on the sides of him like in his Titans design. He also has a goatee from the classics. Dr. Cortex was redesigned to look more like a stressed madman. His hair sticks upwards, he has cracks in his eyes, his lab coat is a mixture between his old design and modern design. Brio and Engine have the same design similarities to their classic and current selves as well. Now for the story. Cortex, having failed at getting his plans realized for world domination by the scientific officials, plans revenge. He teams up with his high school best friends Brio and Engine and begins to kidnap innocent animals, and then the trio mutates them into ruthless anthro thugs with Cortex's Evolvo Ray and the Cortex Vortex machine. However, 2 test subjects go wrong, so their perspectives of escape are different from each other, as they escape at different times from one another. Here are their perspectives of the story. Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot, having been involved 2 weeks ago, is tired of the experiments. By this point, Crash never gets the treatment to speak proper English, though he still makes sound, except with human vocals. On the 3rd week, Crash Bandicoot attempts to break free but trips over his own shoelaces, which triggers the escape alarm from test subjects. Cortex, Brio, and Engine then chase after Crash, which leads to him jumping out of a window as he falls into the ocean, which drifts our knocked out hero to Insanity Island. Crash Bandicoot, not knowing where he is, runs around curiously in a tutorial stage and runs into a box. Crash Bandicoot picks it up and breaks it, releasing a spiritual mask named Aku Aku. Aku Aku explains that there's a strange omen in the sky and that he feels danger is afoot. He explains that to prevent himself from aging, that he put his soul into masks so that he could continue to protect the islands. He scattered numerous masks around, but can only possess one at a time. Aku Aku and Crash then join forces after Aku Aku asks the Bandicoot where he is heading. And since he can't speak, Crash writes in a paper to explain what happened, and the two decide to begin their journey. After some platforming, Crash and Aku Aku come across some mutated animals, which tries to attack the two. Aku Aku then finds a paper on one of the mutants containing info on Dr. Cortex and his plan to buy the island from a villager king known as Papu Papu. Crash tries to explain to Aku Aku that Dr. Cortex is the one he's trying to find but speaks gibberish, so he pulls out a Wile E. Coyote sign to explain this to him. A few areas later, the two are knocked out and kidnapped by Papu's soldiers. They then have to fight for their own lives against Papu Papu. Even though Crash wins, they are still overwhelmed by Papu's forces, and they're tied up and forced to go to the top of the waterfall known as the Upstream, where they'll drown from the waterfall and die. Crash spins himself free. He then travels past the Upstream and uses Aku Aku to skate safely down the waterfall. Crash Bandicoot then runs to the very edge of the island where a village party is occurring and rides a hog down the area. This causes the villagers, who were warned of Crash's presence, to chase after him. Aku Aku warns Crash not to do so, but Crash is very silly, so he still does it anyway. In the meanwhile, Ripperoo makes it to the end of the party and sets up a TNT trap assigned by Cortex. This causes Crash and Aku Aku to fight him and stop Cortex from backstabbing the village by not giving them food in exchange of owning the island, and having Ripperoo blow up the villages. This leads to Papu not trusting Cortex anymore. In the meanwhile, Crash and Aku Aku travels to the second island, Wampa Island, in which Aku Aku states could be a great home someday. Crash looks at the screen, smiling to break the fourth wall. Crash then has to traverse through a creaky area in the woods. Once reaching the end of it, more of Cortex's mutant thugs are spotted. They are given rules by Pinstripe to kidnap as much bandicoots as they possibly can and to kill Crash if they come across him. Pinstripe then takes a helicopter to the third island. Aku Aku and Crash spies on him as he leaves. Aku Aku, of course, explains that they must traverse through some tough platforming challenges in order to make it to the third island, in which Crash agrees. He and Aku Aku then traverse through areas similar to temples in the first game, Second Island, and then they end up on a high bridge that's falling apart. Crash then platforms and tightropes himself through the area and ultimately finds out about a blimp on top of the final island. Aku Aku then claims that it must be Dr. Cortex's base. Aku Aku then tells Crash to grab onto him and helps glide Crash Bandicoot down to the edge of the island. They are then stopped by Engine and one of his giant robot creations. Engine claims that Cortex gave him orders to attack Crash, and that if he doesn't follow them, then Cortex won't kick him in his special places. Aku Aku complains that Engine is a madman, and Engine fuels this by saying that he's a complete maniac, and that he is aware of it, and also says that in case they hadn't noticed, that there's a live missile in his head, and that he has a reason to be insane. He then fights Crash, but Crash wins, and he used parts of his broken robot to create a motor board to get to the last island. Engine then punches himself in the face to make himself feel better. Then, more bandicoots are being kidnapped by Dingodile when Crash arrives on the shore, which causes Crash to fight and beat Dingodile, who then reveals the whereabouts of Cortex and Brio. Dingodile mentions that they must traverse through a very dangerous factory, but that the guards on the outside are very dangerous as well on the inside. On their way to the factory, Coco Bandicoot runs into Crash and attacks him, not knowing that Crash is her brother. Crash fights back and wins, but Coco uses a device that pulls Crash's pants down, causing her to grab him from under the ball and twist Crash to the ground. As she has him in this lock, Crash Bandicoot makes a signature sound that Coco remembers from when she wasn't mutated. She lets go of Crash, and then she lets him up and hugs him. Coco then explains that she's currently trying to destroy the generators inside of the factory, and that she was just mutated a few days ago. right when Coco is about to team up with Crash, Dingle Dow grabs Coco and says, "You might know where Cortex is, but you won't do a thing if we have your sister, now will you?" Dingle Dow then catches a helicopter to the top of the island, where Coco is then held captive. Brio then says that Coco was a failure, and that it's still not too late to brainwash her. Crash Bandicoot then storms through the factory, beating through the guards, and ends up running into Pinstripe. In Pin's room, Crash defeats him, which causes him to shoot up the reactor, causing Crash and Aku Aku to escape before it explodes. This causes the entire island to catch fire except for the top of it. Aku Aku then looks up and sees that there's a fortress near the top of the island. Crash and Aku Aku decide to traverse through the castle's machinery in order to get to Brio's lab, in which they assume belongs to Cortex. During these events, Cortex and Brio argue about what their next plan should be. Cortex then gets angry and rages at Brio, making false complaints such as himself being the leader and that Brio should follow what he says before he destroys him. Brio gets angry and pushes Cortex. He yells back and claims that Cortex has lost his mind and that they are equals. He also claims that Cortex is not the boss of him. He then says he has a plan of his own to destroy Crash and leaves to his own lab to pick up some of the leftover tonic that he created to protect himself from Crash. Cortex flees and has Koala Khan take Coco to the very top of the island in a lab fortress. Crash appears in Brio's lab and the two fight after exchanging dialogue between Brio and Aku Aku. Crash halfway beats Brio, and with a desperate attempt, Brio thinks about his humanity being sacrificed if he uses the same tonic that transforms his mutants, but takes his chances and becomes a Hulk-like creature reminiscent of the first game. Crash still beats him, and the room sets on fire from one of the tonic vases. As Crash and Aku Aku leaves, Brio returns to normal. He then wakes up and uses his telewatch to teleport out of the burning castle and ends up in the ocean, claiming that he will get revenge on Cortex for what he's done instead of Crash. Crash and Aku Aku then traverse through various dangerous labs of Dr. Cortex, but ultimately end up running into a dead end. Crash hilariously uses Aku Aku as a shield and breaks through the window. In the meanwhile, Cortex decides to change his strategy. He abandons his lab and has Koala Kong carry Coco to the top of the blimp. Meanwhile, outside of the lab in rainy weather, Crash and Aku Aku end up jumping on a strange-looking bird and ride their way through open enemy fire by Cortex's robots in an area very similar to Slippery Climb. They then arrive at the top of the blimp, where it is very stormy and it's nighttime. When approaching Cortex to save his sister, Koala Kong tries to attack, which ends up being a boss fight between Koala Kong and Crash. Crash bests him, and Koala Kong falls off the blimp. Cortex then takes matters into his own hands and fights Crash, parodying the first game's boss fight with a few added alterations. Crash beats him, causing his hoverboard to mess up, and Crash lands into a cave. Crash then saves Coco, and she hugs her brother. Coco then asks if they think that Cortex is actually dead, and Aku Aku claims that if he isn't, then he won't be back for a very long time. Cortex is then seen walking through dark caves with a flashlight, complaining to himself about his defeat, but then runs into a pink crystal. Cortex then does a reading of the crystal with a scanner and finds out about its properties and strength. He then looks at the screen and smiles as it fades off as riveting. Coco Bandicoot. Also, on a side note, Coco's story is much shorter than Crash Bandicoot's. Coco is on day 5 of her transformation. Cortex and Brio are trying to brainwash Crash Bandicoot. Coco sees this as a perfect time to escape. When this is happening, Coco sneaks through in gameplay similar to Sly Cooper and goes undetected. She manages to escape by taking out the top guards in the castle. Coco then uses one of the strange birds that flies at Insanity Island. She randomly lands in the Jungle Rollers area. While traversing through the villages, she is befriended by the villagers, and they explain to her that Cortex is changing animals into mutants, particularly bandicoots, which strikes her attention. Cortex shows up and visits the island, and Coco runs off and hides. She eavesdrops on his conversation, trying to convince Papu Papu that Cortex is a liar, and that he will not exchange control of the island in exchange for food. Papu doesn't listen to Coco, which results in the two fighting. Coco wins and uses a gadget to smoke bomb the room, and she gets away, but travels to the upstream. Needing a way to get down, Coco creates a raft to surf down the waterfall. She then lands onto the shore. Coco then travels through Insanity Beach's Coco exclusive route and ends up running into the second boss, which is Pinstripe, who is trying to warn the villagers of her. Coco is then comedically spotted, and she fights them off. She then fights Pinstripe in a very easy boss fight, which ends up with Pinstripe taking a helicopter to the final island. Coco, without any way of getting there, decides to take the long way. She encounters one of Cortex's robots and defeats it. She makes a hoverboard out of the robot's parts and then travels to the second island. Before she makes it, a cutscene of Brio trying to feed her happens, but comedically shows that she had escaped undetected, and Brio throws a fit. When Coco makes it to the shore of Wampa Island, she talks to some of the people there, and is told that an alternate route to the third island is to travel south. They do warn her, however, that this is a very dangerous route. She then travels through the creaky woods and discovers a temple. She spots mutant guards walking around the temple. Coco aims to take them out and does. She eventually runs into a mutant that is bigger than the others. She defeats it and then wonders why Cortex would want to make such creatures. She then travels through the temples until she makes it to the road to nowhere. Coco hilariously questions to herself how any sort of native can make a bridge so high up and tacky at the same time. Coco vows to get revenge on Cortex, and his plans on the screen fades. The scene then unfades to Coco being back at the shore near the end of the village. She then sees that a party is crashed and that Engine is attacking the village, asking for Crash Bandicoot. Coco ends the threat by fighting Engine. The villagers said that a Bandicoot was seen on the first island causing havoc by riding a hog down a small village that was created by Cortex. Growing suspicious, Coco creates a rocket board with Engine's parts and traverses to the final island. On the way there, Coco is attacked while surfing by Cortex's robots. Having survived their attacks, Coco roughly ends up on the shore of the island. More soldiers then gang up on her near the factory. She beats up one of the robots and finds out that Cortex is using these factories to create liquid for the evolval rate to process the transformation seen in most of the androids. Coco questions if there's more creatures like her that are roaming most of the lands. And the robot says yes, before self-destructing due to its programming making a mistake of telling her vital information. Coco then vows to shut down the factory from the inside. On her way to the factory, she runs into Crash Bandicoot at the gate. Thinking that Crash is just another guard, Coco compliments on how he is smaller than the others, and that it should be easier for her to take him down. She then attacks him. Coco wins by using a device that pulls his pants down, and then she grabs him near the balls and tosses him to the ground and pins him. He then makes a sound that triggers Coco's memories of her brother before being transformed. She lets him up and screams bro and hugs him. Coco then introduces herself to Crash, but he speaks gibberish, causing Coco to laugh. Aku Aku then explains that Crash cannot speak. Aku Aku also explains what is going on to Coco, and she explains her part to him. Then they decide to carry on, but then Dingodile, who recently was beaten by Crash, kidnaps Coco and claims that Coco will be the perfect bait for his destruction if Crash follows him. She is then seen kidnapped in the castle, tied up, and being guarded by Koala Kong while on her knees. Cortex describes to Brio his plan of weakening Crash Bandicoot with the castle's defense mechanism. Then, the story ends really badly for Coco, as Brio mentions to Coco that it's not too late to brainwash her, and the screen blacks out, exciting the gamer to play Crash's story if they haven't done so first in order to find out what else happens. Now for the DLC. Yes, I know. You're all thinking, why DLC? Well, relax, because this would actually be DLC worth purchasing. The DLC would be a story that focuses on the gameplay of Dr. Cortex. That's right, the DLC would be about Dr. Cortex and how he lost his sanity. It would explain his final years in high school as well as college, and it would also explain how he met Embryo and Engine. It will also show their reasons for wanting to take over the world. The gameplay would be a lot more linear than the main game, and Cortex would go around shooting things, competing in bizarre competitions for good grades, and more. Well, there you have it, my idea for a Crash Bandicoot reboot. If you like and support this idea, please be sure to like and or comment, because I really like to read what you think of it. But anyway, this has been Crash Legend 25, and I'll see you guys around.